The reading today is from Matthew 13, and it's in two parts. The first part is from verse 24 to 30, and the second part is from 36 to 43. The first part is about the parable of the weeds. Jesus told them another parable. The kingdom of heaven is like a man who sowed good seed in his field. But while everyone was sleeping, his enemy came and sowed weeds among the wheat and went away. When the wheat sprouted and formed heads, then the weeds also appeared. The owner's servants came to him and said, "Sir, did you sow good seed in your field? Where then did the weeds come from?" "An enemy did this," he replied. The servants asked him, "Do you want us to go and pull them up?" "No," he answered, "because while you are pulling the weeds, you may uproot the wheat with them. Let both grow together until the harvest. At that time I will tell the harvesters, first collect the weeds and tie them in bundles to be burnt, then gather the wheat and bring it into my barn." The second part of our reading is Jesus explains the parable. Then Jesus left the crowd and went into the house. His disciples came to him and said, "Explain to us the parable of the weeds in the field." Jesus answered, "The one who sowed the good seed is the Son of Man. The field is the world, and the good seed stands for the people of the kingdom. The weeds are the people of the evil one, and the enemy who sows them is the devil. The harvest is the end of the age, and the harvesters are angels. As the weeds are pulled up and burnt in the fire, so it will be at the end of the age. The Son of Man will send out his angels, and they will weed out of his kingdom everything that causes sin and all who do evil. They will throw them in a blazing furnace, where there will be the weeping and gnashing of teeth. Then the righteous will shine like the sun in the kingdom of the Father. Whoever has ears, let them hear." Here ends our reading for today.
Hi, it's good to be with you again. Around this reading that is from Matthew chapter 13, it's the reading for today, the parable of the weeds and the wheat. And I hope you've inwardly digested and heard what Ken read, because we will work away at trying to extract from what Jesus meant by this parable as we go. And I'm going to use, a few times I'm going to use other Bible passages to help illuminate this one. And the first of those is from Genesis chapters 1 to 3, which I hope you have some familiarity with at least. And that is, if we superimpose Genesis 1 to 3 over the parable of the weeds and the wheat, then what we will see is that Genesis 1 to 2 can equate to the wheat field of pure wheat, the garden of pure goodness, Genesis 1 to 2. And in superimposing chapter 3 as well, we there are able to see that into the wheat field is seeded the seeds of evil. And so in my mind, it's quite a short step to recognizing, therefore, that in the way God has not only created the universe but created us, our hearts are the wheat field. And into our hearts is also sown the seeds of evil. So, Genesis 1 to 3 and the wheat and the weeds brings us back to the heart, and that's a good place for us to be because it's always where Jesus ended up, with the heart. The second takeout from this parable is, you will have noticed, and probably as a result of our first reflection, that no human being in the end extracts the weeds. The weeds are extracted you'll see in the second, in the explanation, you would have heard that Jesus came to the disciples. The weeds are extracted by angels. We don't have that competence. We are left out of that work, and probably for very good reason, given that if our hearts are seeded not only with wheat but with weeds, it might be that over time, or quite quickly, we ourselves are confusing the weeds in us with wheat and vice versa. So it's angels that extract the weeds in the end. And then you'll see with this parable and all the parables in Matthew chapter 13, parables of the kingdom of heaven, that there's a lot of waiting that must happen. There's a lot of patience required of us, the participants in Jesus' teaching. And that is because, and this is the takeout, as Isaiah said, God's ways are not our ways, and God's thoughts are not our thoughts. God does things differently. And what we are painfully aware is that God's timing to do things is different to the timing that we would apply to any situation needing something done. It seems as if God has all the time in the world, and it seems as if we are always short of time. And so, in the delay of extracting the weeds out of our wheat field, we trust in the timing of God. It's different to ours. That brings me to another parable that Jesus told, the parable of the seed growing secretly. I think you'll find it in Mark chapter 4. And in the parable of the seed growing secretly, well, it's no secret that the seed is growing secretly. What the parable says is that a man sowed his field with seed, and whether he slept or whether he was awake, the seed grew. Stalk to ear, ear to full-blown harvest. And the man, all he did was, he was involved at the beginning, he was involved at the end, but what happened in between happened in secret. And the growth of the seed followed. That is, unless the man decided to tamper with the secret growth that was going on below the ground. If he started to think, listen, I can make this quicker, man. You know, I know this is a bit ridiculous, but I'm coming to an application of it. If he decided, listen, let me dig up this seed and pull it into its growth, make it happen, because I can't wait this long for it to come into stalk and then into ear and then into harvest. Well, we know what would happen. The growth would stop, and probably the seed would die. But here's the application, friend, that I think it's axiomatic to say that this is the futility and the destructiveness of aggressive atheism. And we, in the 20th century, have ample examples of that. Stick around. We're not waiting for God to create the weed-free utopian society. We'll do it ourselves. So said in the 20th century a few governments of nations. We'll do it ourselves. We'll bring the weed-free society. We're not waiting for God. Well, what followed was the deaths of the seed, metaphorically, but the deaths of millions of people. Families were destroyed and scattered, homes broken up, farms confiscated, small holdings really during the Russian Revolution, where a crofter, a small farmer, had worked really hard and had invested and had done very well, and perhaps his neighbor had done none of that, and eventually the plot next door was bearing nothing and had to be sold, and he bought it and he extended a little bit. Well, for those who decided we can leave God out of this, we know what a weed-free society looks like, they identify him as a weed because he's just doing too well. And so farms were lost, and many of the millions who died of starvation. So I probably spent a bit longer on that illustration than I intended to. But it just does make the point about the seed growing secretly. The seed of the kingdom of heaven, the seed that will bear the wheat and bring the weed-free utopia, is something we leave to God. When we take it into our own hands and say we cannot wait for God, destruction and bad things come about. So, talking about secrets, the secret of the kingdom of heaven, I want to take us to a few verses earlier in chapter 13, just after Jesus has told the parable of the sower and the seed. You all know that famous parable. After that parable, the disciples say to Jesus, they ask him a question. This is so instructive, to ask good questions. They said to him, "Why do you speak to people in parables?" This is the answer Jesus gave. He said, "Unlike you, most people don't know the secrets of the kingdom of heaven." Okay, so far I'm not really hearing an answer to the question, but he goes on and he says, "Those who have, they will be given even more. And those who do not have, even that little bit that they have will be taken from them." I'm saying, is that an answer to the question, why do you teach people in parables? And I can imagine the disciples saying, just as I have said, and maybe you, huh? So let's get this right. You teach in parables because most people haven't understood the secrets of the kingdom of heaven. That right? Right. It's just that the disciples, over and again, were bemused by the parables Jesus told. They didn't reveal any secrets. They just raised more questions. And that we know by the number of times, this time included, Mark tells us after the parable of the sower and the seed, the disciples asked for an explanation of that, which I would have thought was fairly, relatively clear. And after our own parable today, the weeds and the wheat, they asked for an explanation. So the parables of Jesus are not statements of fact that clear up and expose the secrets of the kingdom of heaven. They are not lovely pastoral stories which are designed to then bring the facts of the matter and make things clear. The parables are metaphors which are specifically designed, this seems pretty clear, that they are metaphors that are specifically designed that when we hear them, it causes us to say, huh? Causes us to think and to ask, what did that mean? That's why Jesus taught in parables, to expose the secrets of the kingdom. Remember his core teaching, Mark chapter 1 verse 15, the kingdom of heaven has come near. It is now. You can step into it, but first you would need to repent. That is to say, you would need to change the way you think, otherwise you will not understand the kingdom of heaven. And the parables are designed to get us to think. And this then leads on to that other mystifying statement of Jesus when he said, those who have will receive even more, and those who do not have will have even what they had taken away from them. This, in fact, is a principle in our modern times called the Pareto principle. It's the 20%, 80%, in which in any given system, and it's very well received. I've not seen anyone who really disputes the Pareto principle, that in any given system, 20% of the input produces 80% of the output. And 80% of the input produces only 20%. So in a business environment, 20% of the people produce 80% of the output. And by the way, let's be clear, we're not talking about the 20% of managers who produce the 80% of the output. We're saying that amongst the managers, 20% of the managers produce 80% of the management input. And 20% of the workers produce 80% of what the workers produce. That's what the Pareto principle is. So it still sounds rather harsh from Jesus, isn't it? Would Jesus have agreed to the Pareto principle? And perhaps there's no choice, because that's been really well established, that that's how systems work. But Jesus himself, long before Mr. Pareto came up with the Pareto principle, in fact, hundreds of years before, Jesus taught the Pareto principle in another parable. In Matthew 25, if you remember, the parable of the talents. To one he gave 5 talents, to the other he gave 2 talents, and to the last one he gave 1 talent. And at the end of the parable, he who had 5 talents got 5 more, and more upon that. And he who had 2 talents got more, and the one with 1 talent had even what he had taken away from him. Now, read that parable, and you'll see that the person who lost his 1 talent is explaining to the one who gave the talents why he's just giving 1 back. And this is how he begins. He says, quote, "I knew you to be a hard man." That's enough. That's all I need to hear. I don't know about you. I knew you to be a hard man, that you harvest where you have not sown. And, well, that attitude in this person, I imagine, would have shown up not only in the workplace. I knew the boss to be a hard man. That spirit in this person would probably have known a lot of his neighbors to be not very savory, and members of his family who he knew to be this, that, or the other. And then the parable goes on to say, knowing you to be a hard man, I was afraid. And so not only does Jesus' parable, those hundreds of years ago, express the Pareto principle of modern times, it also expresses a tenet of psychology, cognitive behavior therapy, which says the thought that we have, what we know, creates a feeling within us. In this instance, created fear, and it was on the basis of what he felt, generated by what he knew, that he acted, and he acted out of fear, and nothing came of his talents. And so, in that parable, Jesus explains, and when he's explaining here in chapter 13, those who have will be given more. If you and I had resources that we wanted to entrust to another person to work with, would we entrust it to someone in the 20%, or would we entrust it to someone in the 80%? And I think the answer is obvious. We would be foolish to entrust our resources to somebody in the 80% who only produces 20% of the output. We would give it to those who produce the most output. And in the parable, that's exactly what Jesus is saying. Those who had much produce much because of what they knew, because of an open-heartedness, because of a trust of the future, because of a trust of those with whom they work. Much came. And so the parable of the talents amplifies what Jesus is saying here when he says, the secrets of the kingdom of heaven, well, those who have much will be given much more, and those who have little will be given only a little, which is to say, if you know that God is the King, a wise and loving King of everything, then you will understand better the secrets of the kingdom of heaven, and you will leave the removal of the weeds to the wise and loving King. If you're not clear about the fact that God is King, if you value what you know more than you value what God reveals, then Jesus went on to say, if you have a look at it in those early verses, after he said to those who have much will be given more, he says, quoting Isaiah, if you're not clear that God is King, you will listen and listen, but not hear. You will look and look, but you will not see. The kingdom of heaven will remain a secret to you. It will not make any sense as long as you know that you're king and not God. So finally, a last takeout from this parable of the wheat and the weeds. It just seems clear that Jesus is saying, trust the truth. Trust the truth. The weeds will be dealt with. It seems in our world that liars just continue to lie with impunity. And I don't know about you, it frustrates and angers and annoys me when I see leaders looking into the camera, looking out from the TV, lying through their teeth, and I want to rip the weed out. Jesus is saying, trust the truth. The truth has a bad way of surfacing when the liar least expects it. Trust the truth will out. Listen to what he says in Luke chapter 12 at the beginning. Meanwhile, when a crowd of many thousands had gathered, and then Luke adds an interesting little note, so that they were trampling on one another, Jesus began to speak first to his disciples. This is what he said: be on your guard against the yeast of the Pharisees, which is their hypocrisy. So their hypocrisy in terms of our parable for today would be that they're unable to accept, to own the weeds in their own heart. Be on your guard against their hypocrisy. Now listen to this. There is nothing concealed that will not be disclosed, or hidden that will not be made known. What you have said in the dark will be heard in the daylight, and what you have whispered in the ear, in the inner rooms, will be shouted from the rooftops. The exposing work of truth is a very scary thing. And I suppose it's what the liars and dictators and totalitarians and our neighbors and ourselves fear the most, to have our lies exposed by the truth. Jesus is saying the weeds will come out, the truth will prevail. And so we can trust that. We can trust that the righteousness of God, coming off the two-edged sword of truth, will, on a day, at a time, come and eradicate the world, the wheat field of the weeds. But now here's this other thing, you see, and that is, if I have to think about what I have concealed, if I have to think about those inane and insane thoughts that I've had in the inner sanctuary of my mind, in the inner room of my house. If I have to think on Sunday, I stand up in the pulpit and through the microphone is spoken what I've left unspoken, what I've left concealed within me. That is a very scary thought. I would not want that to happen. And if I were to find a metaphor, I would agree with the metaphor Jesus gives. It would be like being thrown onto a fiery furnace. If my innermost thoughts, what is concealed in me, was spoken out here through the microphone to people who I don't know. I know some, I do not know all. I know the faces, but I do not know. It would be, this place would get very hot. This place would get very hot, and I would want to get out of here with weeping and gnashing of teeth. So I go with the metaphor that Jesus gives. When the truth comes, it's a scary moment. But here's the thing. When the truth comes to those who will not own their lies, we will happily see the weeds go. But if we stand on the edge of this parable with our arms folded and tut-tutting about the weeds in the wheat field and do not see the weeds within our own heart, we're going to be in the same place as those who have the truth scare the living daylights out of them all the way into hell. Solzhenitsyn, I don't know if it was by reference to this parable, whether it was or wasn't, it's a great summary of this parable when he said, from inside the gulag, he was with the good guys, but from inside the gulag, Solzhenitsyn said, the dividing line between good and evil is not to be found between this nation and that nation. It's not to be found between this category of people and that category of people. It's not to be found between this political party and that. The line between good and evil goes right through the human heart. Wheat and weeds within our heart. And so, friends, this is where we end. This is where the good news comes. When we trust that the truth will out, we are trusting that the God of truth, the God who loves and heals and restores, will do a work in our trust of Him, in our weed-infested heart, in love and forgiveness and healing, to the point that one day, this day, the next day, a noteworthy harvest of wheat will come from us. And as the explanation in our parable today says, that we then, for those around us, will shine like the sun. Trust the truth of God to be the truth of love and healing and forgiveness, and you and I will shine like the sun. God with you.